In this video, I'm going to explain the concept of single responsibility principle. Why single responsibility principle is needed and what are the advantages of single responsibility principle. Without any further delay, let's get into the topic. The single responsibility principle says a class must have only one reason to change. That is, whenever we define a class, right, it must have only one functionality. Here, having only one functionality doesn't mean the class should contain only one method or property. You can have as many methods or properties as long as they are related to the single responsibility of the functionality. Here, we are concerned about the functionality rather than the code components, the number of code components. So with this principle, the class becomes smaller, cleaner, and easier to maintain. Now here comes the question. Why do we need the single responsibility principle when we can do everything in a single class? So let's get into the example. Let's look at this class named invoice, which has got the default constructor where we are initializing the invoice amount as 0. It has got three different methods, namely add amount, deduct amount, and send email. So what we are doing in add amount, we are checking if the amount is less than or equal to 0. Then we are raising an exception for the meaningless transactions. And in case if the amount is greater than 0, then we are adding that invoice amount, and then finally we are specifying what is the added amount and the total invoice amount after the addition. In case of an exception, we are logging that information here. Similarly, we have implemented the same for the deduct amount. So the logic is almost same except that we are deducting the amount from the total invoice amount. And coming to send email, we are just printing email sent for the invoice amount instead of implementing the code to send email, because we are just demonstrating the concept of single responsibility here. Now let's go ahead and see what we get when we are running this code. You could see we have done the addition of 10 rupees to the invoice amount initially. So it has mentioned the add amount is 10 and the invoice amount is 10. Whereas the deducted amount is 2 and the invoice amount becomes 8 here. And as we have invoked the send email, it has displayed email sent for the invoice amount is 8. Now let's invoke the add amount with some negative value and then run it. Now you can see it has raised an exception saying that it is invalid invoice amount. Let's see how can we implement the single responsibility principle in this example. If you observe, add amount and deduct amount are the responsibilities of invoice class, whereas log exception and send email are extra responsibilities for invoice class. Suppose if you want to reuse this logic of logging the exception and sending email in some other class like purchase order or maybe contract, you will never be able to do with ease because you have made these as part of invoice class. So every time you want to implement, either you need to copy the same logic to the other classes, or you have to make changes to the code in all the classes. So which will be a tedious process. So let's see how can we resolve this with the single responsibility principle. If you look at this invoice class, this is the old implementation where we have implemented the add amount, deduct amount, and send email as part of the same class. So which deviates from the single responsibility principle. So now what we have done is we have pulled these add amount and deduct amount separately from the rest of the responsibilities. So the invoice will no longer will be holding the responsibility of sending email and logging the exception. If you look at the new implementation of invoice class, we are implementing the iInvoice interface. If you go to the definition of this iInterface, so we have defined the abstract methods add amount and deduct amount. But why do we need this interface? So interface will help us achieve the loose coupling. So we don't want to strongly couple these details of implementation to our logic. So now when you come back to our code, you see we have initialized the invoice amount as 0 and we have created the logger object. And it is the same logic that we have defined as in the older implementation, except that we are returning the value of invoice amount. Now you look at the invoice code, it has got only two responsibilities. Now look at the messaging service. The messaging service has taken the responsibility of displaying the invoice amount. Suppose I want to extend this logic to send an email here. I can do it independently here without touching the invoice class. Similarly, the logger. I have defined the logger code here. What should happen? So it has to go to this particular log file and write the log messages. And suppose if I want to add few more changes to this particular code, I can do the changes to the logger code without affecting the invoice code or its functionality. With this, what happens is that as logger and messaging are individual components now, they can be reused without any hassle. So now I go back to the design concept, and if I run this, if you observe, so whenever I added money, it is saying the amount added is 50 and the invoice amount is 50. Similarly, when the amount is deducted, it is updating the invoice amount, and similarly when minus 50 is done, so it is as per our expectation, it is supposed to throw error. So it has mentioned none here. Let us see the logger. So in the logger, what we have mentioned is we have asked the logger to input that information into the design concepts of log in the output directory. So when you open this, you can see invalid invoice amount minus 50. I strongly believe now you understood the concept of single responsibility principle and how it is going to help achieve better code quality and loose coupling. The motivation to use single responsibility principle comes from its capability to make it easier to localize errors and for the code maintainability and testability, and also for the scope of parallel development. Suppose I and you were working on two different modules, say invoice module and the logging module. While you are working on invoice module, I can work on the logging module without affecting any of your changes on the invoice module. And at the same time, we also achieve loose coupling using the single responsibility principle. If you have any queries, please feel free to comment below and I will definitely answer your query. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.